All right, welcome everyone to the second part of our Chiron in Aries series. Part 2 is going to start Chiron in Aries transiting through all 12 houses. Tonight we're going to look at its transit through the first house and the second house with some chart example. Before we do, first of all, our housekeeping slide. Here at EAN, you can study with us 3 different ways: our free weekly audio podcasts, subscribing to our astral library, or enrolling in our evolutionary astrology course, which you can see on your screen. You want any more information, our phone number and our websites on the bottom. Leroy would be happy to walk you through any questions, or myself if you happen to catch me answering the phone. Now, what I'm going to do tonight, first of all, is a few of the slides that we looked at in part 1 through the archetypes and cycles. I am just going to put these on the screen. I'm not going to go through them in a lot of detail because I would like to allow as much time as possible for us to do some actual chart interpretations. So here you can see Chiron going into Aries 2018-19 all the way through 26-27. It is going to have a little over an 8-year cycle transiting through the sign of Aries. Here's a visual on your screen to show you how eccentric the orbit of Chiron is. Jupiter in pink, Saturn in yellow. This white one right here is Chiron, and as you can see from the center of the sun or our solar system right here, Chiron actually dips inside the orbit of Saturn, and it actually dips out or outside or in, outside the orbit of Uranus here and green. And so because it is so, close to the sun here, so far away from the sun when it's over here, it makes Chiron have a very eccentric orbit through the 12 archetypes of the zodiac. And as a matter of fact, Chiron will spend 3/5 of its cycle, or 30 of its 51 years, in just 4 signs: Aquarius, Pisces, Aries, and Taurus. And as you can see, we are finishing up a whole entire cycle of Chiron, ending up in Pisces. We're starting a brand new 50-51 year cycle in Aries this year. So again, this is a good visual for you to refer back to from time to time, if you would like to just give you an idea of how fast it will go through. For instance, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, versus how slow it goes on the opposite side of the zodiac. Here's some Chiron archetypes for you. Many of you may know Barbara Hand-Clow called it the Rainbow Bridge because of how its orbit lies between Saturn, individuated consciousness, and Uranus, individuated unconsciousness. Chiron bridges the two. Chiron is always working to make anything that we will call a wound more conscious so that we can heal it. There's another good archetype or cliche phrase for Chiron: the wounded healer. Because when we heal our own wounds, we turn that wound into the gift that we can use as a healer. So Chiron also rules all of the alternative healing arts that we have. Some even feel that Chiron has a rulership or co-rulership of astrology as one of the healing arts. Kairos in Greek means hands. You can see how it rules the healing touch, Reiki, and again, anything in that alternative world that you want to consider to be of healing for us. Now, Barbara Hand-Clow actually thought that Chiron had rulership of Virgo and the 6th house, which of course would then bring in the whole rulership around nutrition, diet, exercise, and rest. Evolutionary astrology doesn't have any hard and fast rule on that. It's kind of, what do you call it when astrology in general really hasn't decided. So it's kind of a timeout yet, or there isn't a general consensus behind the astrological world in general yet. Now, in our archetypes, I talked about how we manifest disease through SMEP. Starting, every physical imbalance has an emotional imbalance behind that. Behind the emotional imbalance is a mental one. Behind that is a spiritual imbalance. So every illness starts with a spiritual disconnect from source, which then becomes a mental distortion, which then becomes crystallized emotions, which then condense into a physical manifestation that we call a dis-ease. I did talk about in the archetypes how I thought the whole world understood this, and I really haven't read too much about this. But if you study the 4 elements in astrology and you look at the least dense to the most dense, spiritual to physical, you can see how this really makes sense. Well, in the same respect, healing works the same way. Anytime we have what we're going to call one of those quote unquote self-healing miracles, it actually starts with a spiritual or energetic reconnection to universal source, a recognition of how we co-create with source in the universe. This will then condense down into mental shifts of a quote unquote positive nature in which we are changing our outlook in some way. That will condense down into an emotional self-acceptance or self-love somehow, which then condenses into the physical with the release of the dis-ease and the body re-establishing an equilibrium of health within itself. So whether we're manifesting an illness or we're manifesting healing, it starts from the most energetic level down to the densest physical level in that order. And I personally think that this could be one of the most aha things you could recognize about the archetype of Chiron as you want to look at Chiron as the ability to raise the consciousness to heal ourselves, to bring the wound into the light, to then release it and heal it. Okay, Chiron retrograde, of course, in Aries is going to point to Libra. It's going to require listening and observing the other, the whole fairness and balance that we want to search for in any type of situation with any of our relationships, both Aries and polarity Libra, square Cancer and Capricorn, which is home and family and career. So it brings in those 4 quadrants or 4 points in the circle of the biggest areas of relationship in our life. Chiron retrograde in Aries is also going to require a willingness to ask for help, because Aries is me, myself, and I could do it myself, and Libra is the other. When Chiron gets involved here, sometimes we need the other in helping us heal to the ultimate level of source itself, and then anyone else that we're going to consider a healer that helps facilitate our own self-healing journey or process. Now, Chiron in Aries trend, well, Barbara Hand-Clough thought Chiron would always bring an alchemizing process to the evolutionary journey of every planetary aspect, meaning that transiting and progressed and solar arc Chiron aspecting natal planets helps us make that natal planet and its wounds conscious, in addition to Chiron itself as it's forecasting. And then when any transiting progressed and solar arc planets make aspects to Chiron, they help Chiron create an alchemy to heal itself as well. It goes synergistic. Now, I could give a gazillion slides here, but in general, one of the things that popped in for me is when we've not spent the last 7, 8 years healing through Chiron in Pisces, and quite frankly, when you look at it from the perspective of reincarnation, probably isn't too many of us who can do 100% of our healing through one Chiron cycle or one transit of Chiron through Pisces. We may have various degrees of healing, but we could have various degrees where we didn't heal. We clung to the story of our wound or karma in some way. So in general, whatever's not healed with Pisces will recycle the issues onto Aries. And Pisces, remember the sadomasochism from our human-made conditionings via religion. Refer to part 1 archetypes for more detail. If it's the victim consciousness, we can run into that deep sense of unworthiness, which will have us collapse and create a lack of initiative within ourselves in regards to being able to create anew with healing with Aries. If we have that victor consciousness, okay, this is the masochist and the sadist in extremes. The victor consciousness, we're not going to want to recognize the wound, or we want to protect that wound. And it can come out into those distortions of Aries that we will call anger, lashing out, or even revenge. I get you before you get me. And all we have to do is look out at planet Earth right now to see that we have all kinds of Chiron in Pisces wounding that even now creates that lashing out energy. 2018 will go back and forth between Pisces and Aries. So don't let go of all the Aries archetypes yet. Again, more of that in detail on part 1. For now, I'm just wanting to give a brief little reminder that we go back and forth between finishing up with Pisces and initiating with Aries. And just the energy between those two archetypes, the last of the 12 archetypes of the zodiac, the first of the 12 archetypes, finishing a whole cycle, starting a whole new cycle, that energy itself makes Chiron leaving Pisces and going into Aries so much more emphasized in what can we heal and how can we rebirth. I put together this kind of just a little checklist in regards to some questions that you may ask for any of your house transits with Chiron. I should say that, you know, any forecasting planet will always relate back to the natal planet. I'm going to put that, I made a note for that. I'll verbalize it, but I'll get a slide in there for our next class. So we'll see this by exact example here, or by chart example here, as we look at the forecasting Chiron transit. It always has to be related back to that natal archetype and what is going on in that natal archetype to give us some idea of where forecasting Chiron is wanting to transform and heal. So what wounds or wounding needs to be made conscious? What needs to be released? And releasing it in many ways is just going to be giving it back to source. When we incarnate in this human body, we get so caught up in this physical existence that, and it is up to each of us to be self-responsible, but it's also recognizing the ultimate responsibility, of source energy. And so when we can take whatever is wounded within us and say, help me source, help me co-create healing, we're actually inviting that ultimate power to help us. And we can also give that wound to source, because source is going to be able to help us understand how best it needs to be healed. Now, because of that Retrograde of Chiron in Aries pointing towards Libra. How do I listen for feedback from the universe? Inner and outer. The inner is going to be source speaking to us, our own intuition speaking to us. The outer will also be source speaking to us. And oh, by the way, all those relationships that can come from the archetypes of Cancer, Libra, and Capricorn, the opposition and squares to Aries. As we spoke just a little earlier, also with the Libra polarity, not only how do I listen, how do I ask for help when necessary? This might be one of the hardest things for Chiron and Aries to do, and it'll be a balancing act, as we'll see with example. We can go to the extreme of I will do it myself, and we refuse help, or we can go to the extreme of codependency, where we want the other to do it for us rather than stepping up however necessary for us. And then, of course, when we look at anything that is traumatized or wounded within us, how do we apply the self-healing process of SMEP? That's my word that I created for looking at things from the spiritual to the mental to the emotional to the physical in regards to creating dis-ease and in regards to creating the self-healing process. And then as we do that, how do I initiate a new process forward in life? Chiron in Aries. How do I turn those old wounds into gifts that I am going to share? I could type forever as examples, and so I didn't put any pressure on myself. I just said, oh, I'm just going to jot out some thoughts, and if I fill up the screen, I do. This is by no means an inclusive list, but when we have Chiron transiting through the first house, there can be a loss of life force and a need to reconnect with source some way in regards to that life force. Life force being one of the fire elements. Aries is a fire sign. First house is a fire house. We can think that we are the healing force in the universe versus allowing the healing energy of universal source to move through us in our own healing and to move through us in our healing gifts to help others. It will also require us to initiate new self-thoughts. That spiritual going down to mental, Aries being new beginnings. Take every one of your negative self-thoughts and how do you change it into a positive self-thought? Now, let me add a caveat here because the first house is the same archetype as Aries. Aries, first of the 12 signs, first house, first of the 12 houses. All of these little bullet points on this slide are going to work for everybody because same archetype, Aries in first house. And I have to give the credit to this phrase to the teachings of Abraham Hicks, HICKS.com. If you haven't heard of them, a little Texan lady who's been channeling for about 20 years, a group of beings. They're the first place we heard this, and then credit to Leroy because he's the one who really kind of made it that affirmation that we repeat again and again and again. Wouldn't it be nice if money comes to me easily and often? Wouldn't it be nice if my connections to source were so spontaneous that I would just notice my body melting into health? Wouldn't it be nice? Fill in your own story for healing in the direction you'd like to go. There's a need to make an effort to self-love when the instinct is defensiveness. Aries wants freedom. Aries will immediately, whatever's coming at it, get defensive and want to kind of hold up walls or push out. And yet the universe is coming at us with love. to the degree that we can accept it within ourselves, it comes at us from the universe. And yeah, we also want to hold those healthy boundaries. If we go to that polarity Libra, too much codependency, then we perhaps will let others use or abuse rather than holding healthy self-love. There can be self-identity wounds and complexes. And we are going to have to balance that self-responsibility of taking care of ourselves versus seeking help when we need it, as we said earlier in general. And then, of course, this is going to all condense down into the body, having breakdowns or healings could easily be a mixture of both. The areas where we see things change, the areas where we see things perhaps not change. And when you look at it in the context of the fact that we are human beings, and there really isn't going to be any of us who lives forever, there is going to be an ultimate breakdown of the body, which becomes that chironic release of physical form into death. Doesn't mean it's going to happen if you got the transit in the first house. It can happen in any of the 12 houses. Again, look at this perhaps from that archetype of, again, first house Aries being connected in general. When we get into health and wellness with the first house, there can be, issues with the muscles and energy levels. There can be issues with the red blood cells, which have a lot to do with energy. There can be issues with the polarity white blood cells, which are healed by Venus and Libra. There can be issues around the head. There can be issues with accidents. The Aries in the first house is where we look at the psychic 2x4 that gives us the message to wake up and become conscious, Chiron. And when we're not paying attention to that, we get the physical 2x4 to get our attention in waking up somehow, some way. I'm not going to elaborate on the health and wellness issues. I will say every week that if our volunteers recognize something specific to your house transit in the health and wellness area, you are welcome to share however you feel inclined to do so. All I have is this one slide because what I want to do is put as much time as possible into our examples. And apologies for not my computer not being connecting as fast as I wanted. So I may go over a little bit so that I can get close to that 2 hours on our presentation here tonight. So just kind of one slide to bullet point here. And then I'm going to move us right into some example. And so, Leroy, I will allow you to unmute our volunteer. I will invite you to just look at a little bit of the environmental conditioning on the screen. This is a chart of a female. Father passed at 12. Grandmother, whom she was close to, at 21, and mother crossed over when she was 31. Younger brother, no contact, upper middle class, very early short marriage, not a whole lot of relationships. This volunteer hasn't dated for 17 years. Lots of resources, and then made a move across her country and ended up, and of course you see the date there, 2009. We all know what happened in 2008. Pluto went into Capricorn. Who of us didn't go through some financial bumps or upsets? She ended up in a bankruptcy, losing everything, the business and her home, and it created this 180 change in her life. that she has in some ways still been in a process of recovering from. And over the last 3-4 years or so, off and on, there's been a lot of anxiety. There's been waves of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which will fall in various rulerships. It's well known for Uranus and trauma, but you know, you can put it right in there with Chiron. And you know, this chart example has just been, you know, feeling kind of lost in regards to life having no purpose. And right off the bat, if you look at the fact that she's got a 2-degree Pisces rising, she's been having 6-7 years here of Chiron in Pisces, which is as much into the story over these last 3-4 years as when we go forward with Chiron moving into Aries. And as you can see, it'll be 7 degrees before it goes and then finishes up in the second house. I just want to touch base and see whether or not our volunteer was able to unmute, or, you know, all that good old electronic equipment working efficiently. Do I have a live volunteer?
Can you hear me?
Oh, hello there.
Oh, they're good. Yes, we had to play around. Sorry about that.
Oh, I was rattling off, no problem. Now, I'm going to do a little more speaking, okay? And if you want to, while I'm talking, I would invite you maybe jot down a bullet point. I'll try not to monologue, but if I say some things that trigger for you or lead to something you want to share, by all means, we'll try and bring that in there, okay? And my intent here is to go for a half hour more or less, okay? I will also tell you, you're probably getting a pen and paper, all right? Anybody else
Yep, got it.
Anybody else for future webinars? Pen and paper ready, all right? And then just know when you're live, we hear everything in the background, all right? We hear you shuffling paper. We, you know, hear if your phone beeps, so mute your cell phone or whatever in that regard. It's okay if pets bark or meow. We all have that going on, or many of us do. I'm going to do this for those of you who tune into our evolutionary astrology course and my segment 1 classes, where I'm very detailed and really trying to sometimes help beginners move through. I'm not going to be so much of a beginner tonight. Breaking it down to the very basics, okay? We're going to jump right into chart interpretation. I will refer you to segment 1 if you want to learn more. My intent is to be able to give us as much in depth into Chiron as possible, and that's going to be natal Chiron, and that's the foundation that's then going to help us moving into forecasting Chiron to give us some examples of how it could operate through this transit. In the world of evolutionary astrology, of course, we start with Pluto and the south node. Pluto's the soul, south node, the ego of the past. This south node is moving into a balsamic conjunction with Pluto. So this brings up that fruition or relive or mixture of both conditions within the soul. The moon, the emotional nature, is also balsamic Pluto. Now, I'm not someone who likes to put all the lines in when I do a chart. I don't know where that comes from. It's just my personal thing. I sometimes find it distracting. I'm more visual, but what I do want to point out for all of you, the natal Chiron archetype is about 7 degrees Capricorn in the 10th house. It's a double signature archetype. Chiron has 5 aspects in this chart, and so there's a few planetary aspects that are going on. For those of you who may not see this, if we go from Pluto, which is, by the way, about 21 degrees Leo 6th retrograde, we go almost 100, well, we go a little over 135 degrees. Chiron is an aspect to Pluto and the moon. Chiron is a waxing sesquisquadrate to Pluto. It has just moved into the gibbous phase. And if we start with Chiron, we go all the way around the chart to the moon, making a waning sesquisquadrate. That's applying, and so the moon is still full phase, getting ready to go into disseminating. So right off the bat here, Chiron is not in a very comfortable position with Moon and Pluto. Do not read good, bad, positive, negative. That is just not evolutionary astrology. I don't care what the aspect is. You can make it blossom. I don't care what the aspect is. It can turn out to be upsetting. You look at it as being the phasal relationship with an aspect if it's there. You look at it being where does it distort and where does it naturally express. Anything can be used or abused. The other aspects that we have going on is, of course, you see Mercury is also in Capricorn, 10th, 2 degrees, balsamic conjunction to Chiron. And we have, if you start to notice this, the Chiron opposition to Uranus, and it's a gibbous phase opposition. It's not exact yet. And with wide orbs, Jupiter is making a first quarter square to Chiron. Saturn is making a last quarter square. We have a wide grand cross with Chiron, okay? In addition to, as I said, the aspects with Moon and Pluto. I need to take this back. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 planets in aspect to Chiron. Have you recognized that, volunteer, yet? I don't know where you are in astrological studies. So if you weren't aware of this, you have a lot of Chiron aspects, my dear.
Yeah, I've never understood Chiron a lot. I'm sort of still learning astrology, so that's why I was like, oh, yay, of course.
Sure. Sure. Well, don't feel too bad because our next chart example has 8 aspects to Chiron, okay? and because we use the whole cycle of phases and aspects, we're going to come through a lot more aspects with Chiron than probably what many of us even recognize. A Virgo soul, Pluto in the 6th house with the South Node conjunction, just the description of having resources, losing resources, resources being an Earth archetype with, 6th house Virgo. Pluto conjunct the South Node. This is the fruition with resources. This is the relive with resources. So I will say right off the bat for you, honey, you have a soul that's having to learn how to have an emotional connection with resources. Moon, balsamic, Pluto. And on a very deep emotional level within your own soul and its ego, Moon, balsamic, Pluto, South Node, balsamic, Pluto, you're having to you're again, your soul's having to make an emotional connection with resources, and I would say even an emotional connection with the ultimate resource source providing. So now let's look at Chiron over here in this waxing sesquisquadrate to Pluto, and it's just moved into the gibbous phase, okay, which the gibbous phase is where we have to make all of those Virgo-like adjustments in life. When Chiron is in Capricorn and or 10th house, there's going to be woundedness around manifestations in the material world. There can be some type of wounding that comes along, perhaps in regards to work or career. There can be the woundedness of the, as I like to say with Capricorn 10th and Libra, woundedness around the psychology of taking charge of your life. And when we start to bring in this sesquisquadrate to this natal Chiron here, you're having to adjust from being in charge of it from an outer level to earth houses, to learning to have your soul take charge on an inner level. In other words, no matter what's happened in that outer world, can you find some way to connect with Source, to relate to Source, that you'll be provided for? And of course, sometimes when we have 6th house Plutos or Virgo souls, you know, we can worry about resources no matter how much we have. Sometimes when we have it up there, those planets up there in Capricorn in the 10th house, and you've got it double, it can be, if I can't see it, if I can't taste it, if I can't Mercury define it in a very left brain way, it's not there. And so one of your natal healings with Chiron, okay, is going to be able to recognize it non-physical first, to then have it manifest physically. Do I make sense to you so far?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that I've always had money come into my life, like, and larger sums from all kinds of directions. Like, I always knew as a child, the only thing I ever said I knew in life was that I always would have money. And I, through jobs, everything. And then when I went bankrupt and lost everything, it was like, wait a minute. And what's happened here? And because I'd lost everything before of like the family aspect, I became very independent. And it was like, that's it. I will take care of myself and make sure I do. But somehow with that bankruptcy, it was like, I came out of it with the knowing I have to trust. I will be provided for, somehow I'll do it. My yoga teacher said, why don't you go get a part-time job at a new retail store? I'm like, oh, great. Like, this is so far below what I've ever done in my life. But you know what? Went in, it's like, take what you can get some money going. And now I make more money than I've ever made in my life. Now, I haven't been able to save, back up, but again, I mean, if someone just looking at it from the outside would say, oh yeah, you're doing really well. And I just, that's the thing I have to keep fussing with, not fussing with, but fighting myself with on the trust. Trust. Yes. You have to do your own work and keep going, but trust.
Well, you do realize you have a 12th house Pluto polarity point. So your lessons are to reconnect with Source. Your lessons are to spiritualize your life or find deep meaning in your life. The other thing that I will point out is your North Node has just went over the ascendant and into the 12th house. The nodes go backwards. They reverse through the zodiac. They reverse through the houses. You just started a new nodal cycle this lifetime. So even though we've got the fruition and relive mixture to do here in, you know, I've got to do it myself, 6th house, you know, I got to work really hard. And these lessons over here of trusting in the universe, no matter how many times it's taken away, it can come back better yet. That's an ultimate understanding for all of us, okay? You've also got this little North Node signature kind of pulling you forward, however incrementally or slowly it seems sometimes, when the relive South Node conjunct a planet, relive fruition, or many times a mixture of both. So kind of just concentrating more on Chiron here. Again, here's the Chiron Uranus opposition. When it's in Capricorn, we're probably going to have Uranus over here in Cancer. It's in the fourth. Here's the early signatures that have been going on. But Uranus retrograde points towards Chiron. It points towards you being able to recognize and understand. Chiron's lighting Mercury up, and it's going to give the left brain energy of Mercury a lot deeper understandings than if there wasn't a Chiron conjunction here. It's lighting Mercury up to understand that some of this familial loss was you learning how to parent yourself. This is a healing aspect of Chiron there. And this is reiterated. Boy, okay. I just had the cat jump on the desk. This is my silent kitty for those of you who used to know my older cats. This is the one who doesn't talk. So we should be okay. But it's also, even your Saturn, last quarter square to Chiron. This is where I would say there may still be some healings needed for you, volunteer, with these 3 planets in Libra 8th and your environmental conditionings about the whole, relationship thing. There's still some energy to heal in this arena for you, whether you choose to do it in this lifetime or whether this, Grand Cross in cardinal signs, cardinal fixed houses, maybe might have you focusing a little bit on relationship with yourself or polarity point relationship with source for a while yet. But know that some of that healing is going to require you to heal it in the intimate relationships as well. Okay. Not trying to pressure, just saying it's still on the agenda into the future. Okay.
Okay.
So, and I'm just even the moon just getting ready to go from full phase to disseminating phase, the waning sesquisquadrate to Chiron. Excuse me, I was going to the sun. Even this right here can describe a little bit of the discomfort in going to intimate relationships. It's easier to relate to the stranger or perhaps four-leggeds with the 6th house,
Yep.
than relate to the intimate partner. So it's okay to heal with the four-leggeds. They give the unconditional love. However, it will at some point require some effort on that intimate level, okay? And an intimate partner who can help you with your own emotional trauma that will always be there when Chiron Uranus oppositions are Capricorn, Cancer. Intimate partner for you has to be able to support the healing of your own inner wounded child. Okay. And you don't want to draw on a codependent partner, but you also, again, have to be careful of your own isolation. That doesn't allow you. I mean, this is all, I mean, this creates a lot of this Grand Cross, cardinal signs, creates a lot of energy where any partner for you, there has to be an extreme of communications in order to understand how all 4 of these 5 archetypes with Chiron and Mercury, how all these archetypes want to be heard, want to be understood. Everything, every planet that Chiron touches is in need of healing. We can say it generally for every planet we all have, but there's a little more emphasis when there's specific aspects going on to Chiron. So your Mercury balsamic Chiron signature is going to say, all my relationships to help me heal must have communications, communications, communications in both directions within cross. Now, let's start looking at forecasting Chiron, and I'm just going in and putting this symbol right here, okay? First of all, I would venture to say as we're finishing up Chiron's transit through Pisces in this first house, It's had a little bit to do with you feeling lost within yourself and not really knowing who I am, not really having a self-identity. Yes, it's requiring and deepening a relationship with Source directly one-on-one, Pisces first house, but it can be part of this despondency, and it may be part of Chiron's dissolving all of these old, wounded conditioning patterns that have been happening with Chiron, for how long that came in this snapshot. And I would say for all of us, Chiron finishing up a transit through Pisces, who of us wouldn't have those cycles of confusion and clarity going back and forth and back and forth? So in that confusion or out of sorts or despondency, Neptunian words, in that part of the cycle, again, it's just saying, where are you, Source? I need you. I want you, Source. How do I have you in my life? And when it's finishing up this first house here with Pisces, it's direct one-on-one conversations. And you have the potential as it leaves Pisces and goes into Aries to really initiate a new relationship with yourself. Chiron is going to come along and make the second first quarter square to itself. And I got my little handy dandy Chiron forecasting, okay? Let me just check this out for you. It will happen in 2020, okay? And you will only have Chiron square itself 3 times. Again, sometimes it can happen 2 retrograde cycles, 5 hits. You will only have the 3 first quarter hits coming in 2020. So here's where you're really wanting to be working upon. How do I consciously rebirth my life force? Feeling life has no purpose. 6th house Pluto, Chiron up here in the 10th. I've got to be in charge of creating my life.
Mm-hmm.
Chiron's been going through your Pisces first house. Wow, who you need to take along on these initiations with you. It's okay to be alone, okay? But every time Chiron's retrograde, you might want to make a little effort to just reach out, even if it is simply reaching out to some type of healing class.
I do lots of those. I'm always studying something.
And because Chiron is retrograde in the first house, which of course is that body, it can be doing all of the hands-on reaching out. You don't always need someone to physically communicate, although it's important again, and you need it in intimacy. But 7th house polarity Libra, you can reach out and get massage or Reiki or, whatever kind of hands-on body work that you may be attracted to. And that body work may break up whatever's crystallized in the body physically and emotionally. Allow you to emote and release, especially with Chiron in Pisces. And the emoting, when it gets into Aries, perhaps some healthy anger. God darn it, I want to live. I get the right to be here as much as anybody else. What the fluff am I supposed to do next, Source? A little bit of that energy coming through. And then if you're Virgo soul, okay, you would want to be questioning guilt in every way. Jeffrey Green used to say in his teachings that somewhere around 75 to 80% of guilt on the planet is conditioned guilt. Guilt comes from the Virgo, Pisces, 6th, 12th archetype in general. Okay, let's just say Pluto in the 6th. Maybe the conditioned guilt is 70%. Well, that's still a lot of conditioned guilt. So Chiron here, as it's going to initiate new healing phase for you, Aries and the 1st house, to the depth of your soul, in aspect to your natal Chiron, questioning guilt. Capricorn and 10th house are consensus guilt as well. This is where consensus society says you must operate the way we want you to operate. And if it wasn't this lifetime with this grand cross, you maybe could have gotten self-talk that anytime you put energy into healing yourself, that was a waste of resources. That was a waste of time and energy. You've got things to do. And so transiting Chiron here, making a 1st quarter square, if that's any of your picturing, can just be going, wait a minute, it's in my 1st house. There isn't anything more important than healing this temple my soul resides in.
Yeah,
How
I'd
do I
say
heal it? Go ahead. Let me shut up.
yeah, no, I do a lot of, and have forever. Like I was doing acupuncture and Reiki and all the modalities when people didn't even know what those names were. So I've always been big into them. And frankly, I don't know how I would be physically if if I hadn't always
Good.
done that, because I find that with all the energy work and everything, my biggest issue with that Virgo is the mental self-flagellation. I mean, I beat myself my whole life, is just beat myself mentally. It's like enough to drive me crazy. It's like, and try everything to get it to not be so dramatic all the time. That's probably been one of my biggest pursuits in life.
And Mercury, okay,
I know.
ruler of that south node
South
by
node.
sign
I know.
and house. And Mercury rules Pluto by
Pluto.
house. So look at how closely Chiron is related to what we would call the karmic complex in the soul, especially from the karmic dynamic from the past. So you're hitting the nail on the head. One of the most important things for you is, of course, you'll always be continuing with this, 12th house polarity point, Pisces polarity point, but to really perhaps do some effort with the mental level. Okay. And Chiron's 1st quarter square, look at, it's going to be, where does Chiron, I'm so, focused on all my PowerPoint slides that I've got to get myself into this date. Chiron's retrograde July 4th is at 2.5 degrees Aries. So you're going to have Chiron 1st quarter square Mercury 3 times, okay? And then, oh, you, my dear, are going to get it 5 times in 2018 and 19. Chiron,
good.
1st quarter square Mercury. Well, shall we repeat this? You think there's going to be a little on the mental plane? But here's the energy. Here's the energy to make the effort. Okay. So all of those, cliches we talk about in creating affirmations, to really, perhaps work with those. If I may, I'm going to just take a little moment and share. Again, I found the Jeffrey Wolfgang teachings of EA in 1985. That was when I had my first reading with him after attending the first astrology lecture I ever attended in my life, which was one he gave on Pluto. And so way back in the early days, I came across, I can't remember what he called it, but I've renamed it JWFG's unconsciousness reprogramming exercise. Here's what I'll do. I'll put that into a slide. Okay, I'm going to make a note here, and it'll be in the PowerPoint slides, which, by the way, if you guys are part 1 with cycles, I added 3 or 4 new slides as I remembered things I forgot. So you can go back and just review some of those PowerPoint slides if you want to. And if you're watching it and wondering why the slide's not there, it's because you would hear me verbally saying, oh, I'll make a note and add it in later. My Pluto Virgo. Anyway, Jeffrey's unconsciousness reprogramming exercise, it's just a self-hypnosis tape. And it basically comes from the premise that you can do affirmations in consciousness, left brain, day in, day out until you're blue in the face. Now, slowly but surely, through lifetimes and lifetimes, we all heal. And we all release old wounds and traumas, and we all break free and evolve and grow. Evolution, slow Darwin, or cataclysmic. And one of the ways to help speed up the slow Darwin day by day, year by year, life by life evolution is to create your own self-hypnosis tape. And when he taught it, you just needed a cassette tape recorder and a little headset. Now you can get those little mini DVR recorders. You can put it on a CD. You can put it on your iPad. You all have to figure out how to make the recording. The point is as you make the self-hypnosis recording, to reprogram your unconsciousness, you will only play this recording in your right ear, right to receive. And you basically make a list of all the, quote unquote negative experiences you've had in this life, all the quote unquote yucky things that have ever been said about you. Kim Marie would say you make a list of every negative spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical event, belief, attitude, emotion, experience, and you take some time with it. And then you make the positive affirmations to heal that. The positive affirmation must be first person, I, me, myself, and I, and it must be present tense, not tomorrow, present tense. Money comes to me easily and often. Every day in every way, I am healthier and healthier and healthier. You make up these positive affirmations specific to your issues, your wounds, your trauma. And then on a good day, you want to record your own voice and saying these affirmations, first person, present tense, with emotion. And you make this recording, and then Jeffrey's suggestion was that you play that every night when you go to bed. Obviously, if you're single, it's a little bit easier than if you're in the midst of a relationship and or you have a baby or a 2-year-old. Jeffrey used to be religious about you got to listen to it every single night nonstop for at least 6 months. And if you miss a night or you miss a week, you got to start over with your count. There have been people who've done it for 2 years. His teaching was that you listen until you see your life change in whatever areas you want to see the change. Now, I would also say to people that when you start listening to it, again, right ear only. You play it softly enough that if you are awake, you can hear it, but it's your own voice gently whispering. And when you first start to play it, it may be that it wakes you up or it doesn't let you get to sleep. But over time, it becomes your own personal lullaby to reprogram what's unconscious. And I think that this reprogramming your unconsciousness exercise is a great chironic tool. And for you, volunteer in the first house transit with this specific square to Mercury, it gets to be just a little emphasized that this might be one of those tools on the mental plane you could work with. And it'll go in and address some of these old wounds that might be unconscious yet here in regards to breaking free and giving yourself some ultimate meaning and value. And then with Chiron on a more personal level, you know, being able to, hold a self-love, being able to fill yourself up with yourself in a more conscious, healthy way. Okay, so I just wanted to share that little exercise for everybody. Let me just stop for a moment and see, volunteer, as you look at this Chiron transit, do you have questions for me? Do you have anything you're wondering about? Put you on the spot.
Yeah, please.
Oh, it's in my first house. No, don't expose me.
So what might I watch for with these squares that are coming up, the 5 of them? Like what might happen? How would you think? How could things?
Okay. I'm going to go a first quarter square to Chiron, then a conjunction to Jupiter, then a last quarter square to Uranus, and then the opposition to Saturn. Okay, that's the way it's going to go with the degrees. Of course, as it makes this first quarter square, what you want to be finding is an ability to feel free. I'm saying feel free, because this Chiron signature is going to have over responsibilities, and relative to the Mercury aspect, relative to its rulerships here and your own environmental conditioning's feedback, that mental self-talk that just cuts you down. Not only would you want to reprogram the unconscious, you got to make every single effort, action, to, on a conscious level, reprogram your mental self-talk. And you know it. Here's the example I would give. You're walking down the street and you catch a reflection of yourself in the storefront window. And, it's like, oh man, I have such gray hair, or, oh man, I'm 20 pounds overweight. Cancel. Every day in every way, my body just glistens and glows with beauty from the inside out. And so you've got to make that effort to repeat that phrase, whatever your phrase is, whether it's something with the body or your thoughts or feelings or beliefs, whatever it is, until you're walking down the street and you catch your reflection in the storefront window and you go, oh, you stop, and every day my body just glows and glistens from the inside out, or whatever the phrase is. That's what you got to do with this Chiron square with Mercury. As it goes over Jupiter, if you're making this effort over these next few years, then when it goes over Jupiter, you really can grow by leaps and bounds with new beginnings. And you can start to bring it in even more with resources. Leroy has a great phrase, and he says it all. I mean, we say it to our young adult all the time. Son, it's not how much money you earn. It's how much money you have left over. It's how much money you save. It's how much money you feel worthy of having in your pocketbook. Something to that effect. Jupiter is going to consciously start changing your beliefs and your belief in your value to be here and take up space on planet Earth, Aries second. And then as it makes the last quarter square to Chiron, to Uranus, here's where we're going to have some familial conditionings that we have to go in and release. Last quarter square, especially any area where we feel wounded. If there are issues around children, you know, with this signature right here, there's the possibility of who knows how many lifetimes you've lost your children. Disease, war, famine. With this Grand Cross, who knows how many lifetimes the marriage didn't work out. So you're going to have a deep old wounding here. Well, if I don't let anybody in, I can't lose them.
Oh, absolutely. If you love them, they leave you.
Yes. Well, there's the last quarter square. Can you release that distortion? You know, and then the whole thing would be then over Jupiter and opposing Saturn is, you know, could there be some courage to perhaps try the relationship thing? And by all means, you don't have to marry him after the first date, as we were joking at a family party about yesterday. Leroy, we ran into his dad's 88th birthday was yesterday. They just moved into independent living. We had the first party in the facility, and it turns out there are all these old neighborhood parents and all these middle-aged or early senior citizens, adults showing up, and there was this neighborhood guy that showed up, and he says, "Leroy, I'll never forget you setting me up for a date." And I was just, nah, I can't, nah. He's, you know, a little bit of a loner. And you turned to me and you said, "I'm only asking you to go out on a date with her. You don't have to marry her." So there's you holding healthy boundaries and learning how to experiment again, Chiron in Aries. And that's going to be that ultimate when it comes to this opposition with Saturn. Oh, and by the way, then it's going to oppose these two and first quarter square your sun. So maybe by the time it gets to the first quarter square to the sun, it'll be over into the second house by then, but perhaps there will be some friends. Again, there's nothing you have to jump into, but that's kind of how it will unfold planet by planet. And here's some examples in the physical world. So what are you going to do about it spiritually, mentally, and emotionally? Moving in that direction, whatever baby steps, Aries first house, feel best for you. Okay? Helpful? And I got to get going.
Thank you. That was awesome.
Okay. Well, thank you for allowing me to have you as an example. I appreciate it very much. And
thank you.
You are most welcome. Pleasure to meet you. And let me quickly check in with Leroy. A question: is there anything that I haven't touched upon? Otherwise, I better be conscious of time and.
No, it was a nice chart example. Thank you for our volunteer number one. Volunteer number two had earbud or microphone issues, so you're going to get to process her somewhat independently, Kim. Okay.
That's okay. And if you and volunteer number two are talking back and forth on the Q&A panel, which I keep closed to not distract myself, you're willing to be her mouthpiece if you want to, Leroy, okay?
Sure, and I'm sure she heard that as well. Yep.
Yeah, we had emailed about that earlier, just in case, because she didn't know if she could get it to work or anything. Volunteer one, just one more time, thank you so much for allowing us to get a glimpse of Chiron's transit through your chart. Appreciate it. As we look at Chiron and Aries then, starting to move from the first into the second house, and also from Pisces into Aries, we'll look at both of those. There can be a woundedness over feeling unsupported by source, second house, earth element, resources. And so what we ultimately do with Taurus second house is Venus is recognize the ultimate resource in the universe. Everything comes from the ultimate resource. And so to what degree is there that feeling of not being supported? And it can be spiritually, mentally, emotionally, or even physically with resources. Where do we feel unsupported? Abandoned is a second house word. You know, the second house is all the survival issues, food, clothing, shelter. So we have to turn that lack into recognizing where the ultimate resource source supports us. There can be woundedness around values. Previous lives have been conditioned in certain ways to value this, not value that. And Chiron and Aries can be opening things up to go, well, wait a minute, how do I feel about this subject? Do I value or not? We could impose our values onto others. We could have others impose their values onto us, eighth house polarity point. We could even maybe not value ourselves. And if we're not valuing ourselves, that can also create a loss of personal meaning in life. So we're going to have to work with creating new attitudes around what's our purpose in life. You know, second house, food, clothing, shelter, survival. It has to do with the talents, and it's one of the work houses. It's like, well, what am I going to do to pay the rent and put food on the table? What is my purpose? What are the talents that help me find purpose in life? All of that, wherever it's wounded or distorted, is going to come up. Then Chiron's going to be wanting to make it conscious and initiate healing. And of course, it can bring all kinds of changes up or down with resources in whichever direction is necessary. There is a need to learn to self-accept. All the self words belong to the second house. Self-acceptance, self-love, self-reliance, you know, whatever you can think of about yourself, put the word self in front of it, and then, you know, self-sex. You know, there could be some wounding around sexuality that can come up when it's in the second house. Eighth house polarity, partner doesn't appreciate me, partner doesn't see me, partner doesn't understand me. How are you going to work to make it conscious in yourself what's wounded, to then work to heal it with yourself, to then go over to that polarity of working to heal it with others? All right. And of course, there will be the possibility of perhaps needing to turn any sexual wounding into healings via sexuality. And of course, it's taking it into sacred sex, bringing spirituality into sexuality. And of course, the um, original understandings of Tantra is to raise the Kundalini. It's not to necessarily see how big of an orgasm you can create, although there's nothing wrong with that. But it is to be opening the chakras from the first to the seventh, which is about expanding consciousness, which is what Chiron in Aries could be wanting to heal and explore in some way. And then, of course, we can always go through perhaps resource crises that could come up so that they can expose any old wounded patterns around money, job, resources, you know, those issues of abandonment and betrayal, either by the partner who leaves, and so, you know, all of a sudden the source of income isn't there, or the losing of the job. In other words, as the second house is the first in the earth element, all right, it is about learning to see the sacredness of everything. Every manifested physical thing in the universe has a spiritual component to it, has a sacredness to it. Even if, for example, and we look at the distortions of the patriarchy at the ending of the Piscean age, every act of violence, every physical manifestation that is distorted is just a woundedness that has not been able to see the light, the sacred light and love of Source. And so Chiron and Aries could be waking up that type of energy with this house transit, and, you know, wanting to be of service and bringing the light back. You know, we can look for the spiritual warrior through all of the 12 house transits. And so that spiritual warrior in the first house is learning how to be a warrior for yourself, learning how you need to break free. And, you know, the fighting of the wound is to break it, make it conscious and release it. And the spiritual warrior in the second house, you know, could be wanting to teach the world about the sacredness of anything that's manifested, or bringing any of the distorted violences in the world into the light to be healed. And, you know, we turn the tide, so to speak, on climate change. You know, we go back to the Superfund site and we make an effort to heal the ground and reclaim it. Maybe not just physically, but working to do it spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and physically. I used to know a gentleman who, he's in spirit world now, but he was a retired science teacher and had been in and out of relationships, wanted relationships, just weren't there, made peace with it. And he spent the last 10, 20 years of his life after retirement just traveling in the US, traveling the world as long as he could. And he was someone who could see ley lines. And he would just visualize, you know, healing the ley lines on planet Earth wherever he went. He could see the devas and the fairies, and he would just communicate with them and ask them, how can I help you heal this spot that I'm visiting? You know, how, and let me help you, you know, heal wherever, you know, land has been raped in some way. So, you know, it's not just the indigenous praying to the spirit of the animal when you killed it before you used it for sustenance. It was doing it before you cut down the tree to create your home. So Chiron and Aries can go all the way to this direction with this house transit. And so, by the way, this is my house transit. So I just want to say before I bring that volunteer on, see, Leroy, I've had Chiron transiting my second house. I can go talk to those little itty bitty plants out there when I'm transplanting them, and I can help them grow.
As you do. As you do.
I know. And I think you've kind of made peace with teasing me. All right, I gotta have a drink of water, but if you could, we'll unmute volunteer number 2. Or no, that's right. She's not going to be able to be.
Yeah, she's
live
not
with
mic'd
us
tonight, so you're going to get to go independently for her chart.
All right. Well, thank you. As I take a drink of water, babbling away here. To me, this is some of the work that I love is just being able to do chart interpretation. So those of you on this webinar, feedback, is this working? Anything that you're thinking I'm missing? I'm already having a couple of notes as I go through the series going, oh yeah, I gotta remember to add this into the slides, blah, blah. This next volunteer, of course, as we're looking at Chiron right here transiting through the second house. She's got the first 10 degrees in the second, last 2/3 in the third house. We have an only child here, domineering mother that was perhaps the source of creating a lot of childhood wounds. We have these two volunteers are only a year apart, so we both have the Chiron in Capricorn opposing Uranus in Cancer. Both of them had father die around 12 years of age. I thought that was interesting too. This volunteer was very close to the I think it was paternal grandmother. The other one was maternal grandmother. This one was close to the paternal grandmother. Uranus in Cancer, both of these volunteers, you know, when there's wounding with mom and dad, sometimes there's that generation apart that will come along. And that would be something interesting with both of our volunteers. I don't know if you remember this or you heard this last time from the cycles, but Barbara Hanclo would say, sometimes when grandparents and grandchildren are separated by about 50 years of age, they're a Chiron cycle apart and they have Chiron close to each other and they go through the same Chiron cycles. And so that can create some of that intergenerational bonding in some way. Now, for this particular volunteer, mother remarried 2 years after father died, was raised with stepfather. Stepfather is now deceased. Christian background, you know, broke away from it. Retired from decades in the banking industry. She had an early marriage for 1 year, and now she has been married for 40 years to her second husband. They have a 31-year-old son, and her first or second husband has a 48-year-old child who is her stepdaughter. And so jumping right in this case here, we're a year later. The chart from the first house transit, and believe me, we're not going to go year by year. The examples come as they come. All I looked at was Chiron's house. I didn't pay any attention to anything else until I start prepping the chart for the webinar. Chiron, look at how the south node in a year had moved past Pluto and now it's new phase, and it's actually new phase by what, 17 degrees. So the south node's new phase Chiron. It's not a conjunction when it's 17 degrees apart. However, this one does have the moon conjunct the north node versus Pluto. Here we have a 7th house Pluto in Leo. So we have a Libra soul. We also have the south node Leo in Libra as well. And of course, conjunct the north node is the moon in Aquarius in this first house, kind of moving the soul forward on emotional levels. This time we're dealing with a Capricorn rising. And this chart, and I don't know if our volunteer knew this, but that's one of the things I really made an effort to go through was the Chiron hits. There are 8 aspects to Chiron. Chiron does not aspect the sun or the moon. Chiron aspects Mercury through Pluto. And I just used the major planets. I didn't bring Aries in to this picture. I don't know how to create it with solar fire. So Chiron aspects Venus, Jupiter, Mercury, Mars, Uranus, Pluto. Oh, and Saturn and Neptune over here. Those who were born in 1953 have this Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Libra, and this soul has a balsamic and both of them retrograde. Remember we talked previously, this one here has Chiron 20 degrees Capricorn retrograde in the 12th house, opposition to Uranus. Here's another grand cross that gets pulled in here with wide orbs. However, this one, cardinal archetypes, mutable houses, 3rd, 6th, 9th, 12th. That's going to put different energies, not to mention this. Let me point out right here, Mercury, balsamic Mars, okay, 22, Gemini to the 21, Leo, Pluto. Here's a yod with Chiron. All right, for those of you who haven't seen that. Jupiter is a separating sesquisquadrate to Chiron. This is the square and a half. Jupiter's just went into gibbous phase. And then Venus, of course, has that wide square to Chiron that we talked about with the Grand Cross that we have going on here. So whereas the previous example had a Chiron Grand Cross relative to a 6th house Pluto, and you saw the emphasis with work but not in relationships, here we have a 7th house Pluto with a Chiron Grand Cross and a South Node in the 7th house, and we have someone who has been married for 4 decades. So you can already just start to see there's a soul difference here. This is a Libra soul, Pluto in the 7th house, all right? And so as I look at the Chiron and start to bring this in here, relative to the Libra soul, one of the questions I would have for this volunteer is, how much energy do you put into helping heal everybody else? And do you sometimes do it at the expense of what you need for yourself? Because at this Chiron signature, and if I raise something up, volunteer, you're welcome to type in. And Leroy, you're welcome to interrupt and give us all feedback. If we look at this natal Chiron signature, all right, again, Chiron in Capricorn, as we spoke before, there could be some type of wounding around resources, around perhaps career. But when we start to mix it in with another archetype, in this case 12th house or Pisces, part of this woundedness with this Chiron signature, we would start to ask questions and say, have there been time periods, and this is even before we look at the Grand Cross. Let's just look at it relative to a 7th house Pluto, South Node 7th, and this Chiron signature. Have there been time periods where sometimes you've sacrificed 12th house, you know, doing things for others at the expense of yourself? There could be woundedness here. Again, this could be a Florence Nightingale signature. And if this Chiron signature holds healthy boundaries, 12th house Pisces, never know where they stop and someone else begins, relative to 7th house Pluto, South Node. If they hold healthy boundaries, great, because this is a healer signature with Chiron here. Okay, Chiron in Pisces, we've all been getting used to that for the last 7 years. However, if there's not the healthy boundaries, then sometimes they may do too much for someone else at the expense of the lessons of what they need to learn to do for themselves. Now, here's a tidbit for you. When you see intercepted signs, meaning Aquarius isn't on the 1st or 2nd house cusp, it's intercepted, sandwiched in between. Same thing with Leo, intercepted in the 7th. Traditional astrology would say that energy, Aquarius and Leo, needs to figure out how to express itself. EA teachings would say, don't assume. Look to see if there's planets in Aquarius and there's planets in Leo or an archetype in Leo. Look to see if the ruler of these two signs has a lot of aspects going on. Sun with Leo. Uranus is in a grand cross here. If you start to see that type of energy that's related to these two signs, planets in those signs, the rulers with lots of aspects, it may be that that energy was emphasized enough in a previous life or two that it doesn't need any overemphasis. It's already there.
Kim?
And that's, yes.
If this helps, we have feedback about this particular chart this native here has. She feels like she does too much and does not have real healthy boundaries. And I can probably expand on that by just saying that she feels like she's creating a new purpose in her life since being retired, learning to use a multitude of talents. And yeah, still has to do a lot for family. So husband is legally blind. She helps out the mother a lot. The son has issues, and even though the son works in dad's business, so it sounds like exactly what I sense you're getting into here.
Yep. There's more to the story. Thank you, volunteer. Appreciate you sharing that. So let me just finish this point with these intercepted signs, okay? Perhaps there might be an overemphasis of this energy. Could be a blend of both. In other words, point is, evolutionary astrology says don't assume the traditional meaning that you've got to express those two intercepted signs. They might naturally already be there. And in the case of this 7th house Pluto or Libra soul with the same nodal signature, there still is somehow this Aquarian energy is going to have to be reborn, or some types of objectivity for herself and finding her own independence and ways to do things for herself coming off of that 7th house Pluto signature. So some of my point was, I'll go back to that, what we were saying before when I'd asked this question of Chiron, is that yes, there can be some woundedness around taking charge of one's own life, having this yod going on with relationships, 7th house, marriage, and some of the family things that are going on as well. When you see the Chiron Uranus oppositions in Capricorn Cancer, you are almost always going to find that that soul has a wounding from childhood within their soul. This one, death of early father, domineering, perhaps cruel mother. And you could also see with the Uranus in Cancer mini generation that they may have offspring that is wounded. The woundedness may be between them, the parent and the child, just like this one had wounding with parent, there could be wounding with child. And again, the details are as varied as the souls in question. Do not assume that the parent was cruel to the child, so now the child's coming in wounded and it has to heal. That may or may not be the case. It could be the opposite. You know, in my situation, I don't have, I'm not even going to just, we won't even go into any planets, but in my situation, I had a stepchild who was wounding to me in past lives, but came in as a stepchild to make amends. Now, I'm not saying this is the case here. I'm saying you question, you observe and correlate. You observe and correlate. You ask for the feedback. Does this feel right for you? It could be the opposite, okay? But here we are starting to then unfold that in a different way. Here's the obligation that this Chiron signature in the Grand Cross, you know, feels towards children, feels towards relationships, maybe feels at one point towards some work responsibilities as well. Venus can be involved with work. When you look at this Grand Cross and cardinal signs relative to mutable houses, what we will start to run into here specific to the Chiron signature, it could be true for the other planets in the cross as well, but emphasizing Chiron, this Grand Cross in mutable houses could start to make excuses or adjustments or reasonings why I've got to help others. I have to ignore or deny or suppress my own wounding because I've got to be responsible for helping everybody else heal all of their wounding. That was going to, seventh house Plutos are orientated towards the other. Their lesson is self. And here's this little emphasis, even though the moon is not opposite or on the Pluto polarity point, it's still the opposite sign and opposite house and conjunct that north node. This is the ego that this soul is striving to create. And the ego in this lifetime is trying to rebirth objectivity in some way. And go, wait a minute, if I don't take a little bit of time out for myself, I won't have anything left within me to help heal anybody else or to help facilitate the healing of anybody else. My other work, energetic balancing, my old boss would always say, nobody heals anybody else. We all heal ourselves. And I like to say we heal ourselves with our co-connection to source. He would always say, we facilitate others healing themselves, that they're responsible for healing themselves. We're each responsible for healing ourselves. So if you can remember that from an objective perspective here, Aquarius, that you're facilitating someone else in their own healing journey. From a Chiron perspective, it sure relieves a lot of pressure and responsibility. And especially if you're in any of those chironic alternative healing fields. Oh my gosh, can you imagine the weight that starts to come on your shoulders if you take on the distortion or wound that you have to be responsible for healing this person? Especially if that person doesn't make it for whatever reasons. And so this could be something that even with this signature, Capricorn 12th house, this is an old distortion, for example, that this Chiron signature could be throwing off. Give it to God. Give it to Goddess. All right, Source, how may I channel you through me in helping to be a facilitator of healing whoever I'm working with, whoever I'm in relationship to, even with myself and what I perceive I need for healing. This is ultimately with Chiron's transit through Pisces, what I spoke about on podcast and in the archetypes. Chiron through Pisces is just channeling source through us. And if we come to the perception that we don't have the ability or power to facilitate that healing, then give it back to source. Source, I know that you can do so much better in helping this person heal than I can. And oh my gosh, what if you even expressed that? I know I got a lot of healing abilities, but I don't know if I'm the best one to be a facilitator of your healing. Perhaps there's someone else who can help you better. Perhaps this is something between you and Source. And you know what? It's okay. I mean, think about the mythology of Chiron and the poison, wasn't it a poisoned arrow or something? Wasn't he the start of the Achilles heel? I'm somewhere I saying I read that or something like that. But you know, the point is Chiron couldn't heal himself. And he surrendered to Source on the ultimate level. He gave up his immortality and died to do the ultimate healing. And so this is something that all of us have to recognize with Chiron's transit through Pisces, what we can heal or not heal within ourselves, what we can facilitate or not facilitate in helping others heal. This is something this soul is struggling with their entire lifetime with this Grand Cross. And it's okay to understand the limit. This signature right here, this mini generation, and especially when Saturn's on the balsamic conjunction side of Neptune in Libra, you know, they have projected so much onto others, making them de facto gods and goddesses, okay? God, you know what I'm saying. Sometimes this signature also, you know, can be, well, I will just ultimately sacrifice my life, Saturn, everything in my life for my relationships.
Kim?
And that never works. Go ahead.
I just have to add right there at this point, looking at all that Libra in the ninth house, retrograde, kind of, you know, emphasizing that square with Chiron in Capricorn. So she reports back that she has a doll business and a clothing business. She sews for people and the poor people of Appalachian children. She feels it kind of helps her heal her inner child, also brings joy to those children. And of course, my Pluto and Leo responded back, "Would you sew a beautiful sweater for yourself first?" And then she came back as saying, well, she works with dolls and has a beautiful doll collection, makes those clothes and dolls for the girls of Appalachia. So this is how intense this servitude can become. And I'm saying intense. It's a beautiful expression of this chart.
Yes.
And yet I'm challenging her to look for that polarity point, to that first house polarity point in a progressive way for herself.
Yes. Yes. When I first heard you, my first thought was, oh, sewing clothing for, you know, others, for poor people. That in some ways may be a healthy way of serving without sacrificing too much. You know, if you're not doing it, you know, let's say someone you personally know, there can be a certain amount of, I feel good making this to give it to the universe, and the universe can determine who would best be served by receiving it. If there is that layer of separation, there can be the healthy giving there. The other thing I wanted to point out with this is that these two planets are the rulers of Chiron. So this adds into this picture as well. Now, I don't mean to just be looking at the distortions or the wounds, okay? And please, I apologize if it feels that way. You know, we're just trying to bring Chiron into the light, and we have some two good first examples here with all these aspects in their chart. So thank you for letting me, be that, you know, bring in that these examples for you. And so, yes, as this person learns how to become more objective with herself and then can be with others with going around like this. What this Chiron can ultimately get to, what it wants to get to, is learning what it's responsible for and what it's not responsible for. So some of what I was saying earlier, about being able to say, I don't think I can facilitate this particular healing. Being able to, again, give it back to God, Goddess. Being able to say, I'm not God. I'm not superhuman. Okay? And as those healthy boundaries come with the first house Pluto polarity point, with a Chiron signature in the 12th, and both of these rulers up here in Libra with this mini generation, the healthier that this volunteer holds boundaries, the more her healing gifts will come through and be received. And the lighter and lighter and lighter she will feel, the healthier she'll feel of being of more service. Now, I haven't mentioned this, and again, I got to be conscious of time. I can get into looking at charts and I can just roll, and time just disappears for me. So, sorry about that. This is a lot of creativity. So I can see the dolls, and dolls can be safer than actual children. We talked previously, these can be some signatures of wounding with the children. This person's going to have multiple ways of being creative, all right? And multiple ways in which, all of this energy can be expressed here. But you also will then have to recognize when you need to recharge the batteries, so to speak, so that you don't run yourself ragged. Now, I probably should move into the forecasting, okay? Need to take a drink. Anything from Leroy while I pause for a moment? So, if you remember some of these examples that we were using when the transit is through the second house, sometimes feeling abandoned by support from source, or perhaps some wounding around various resources in some way. That may or may not be that signature. We've had 27 degrees of Chiron's transit through Pisces. So if this Chiron transit that's finishing up here has been working with that ultimate resource of source, then they can be activating the healing gifts here and going, how can I be a channel for you, source, with resources? Which is what they have been doing with, again, making clothing for those who are poor. So there could be some of the gifts that would be coming through. I would say, if I'm hearing and listening correctly, as this person has, retired from banking, perhaps the resources physically are not such an issue. Perhaps the issue is around valuing themselves. And it will kind of reiterate some of the things that we have been saying here in regards to that Grand Cross earlier. Because if we go to the ruler of the second house, Venus, natal Venus is in Aries in the 3rd. And there can be so many distractions that Venus can be making 3rd house excuses about opening up Aries to what is most important to it. Okay? Venus is part of this Grand Cross that just gets tugged in a gazillion different directions. Venus, as it is first quarter natally to Chiron, there's a crisis in action around what you value, volunteer, and you're being tugged, to think of yourself as much as anybody else. Venus is full phase to this Saturn, Neptune, that's balsamic, that, can have those lifetimes of doing sacrifice that it just doesn't work anymore. And so, yeah, with some of what Leroy was saying earlier, there is, with this transit, perhaps a need to value yourself. And so you could play with, well, if I didn't have a husband or an adult child, or did I hear a parent in some way? I can't remember the details of what Leroy said, but if I didn't have this person or that person or this situation or that situation to take care of, what would I want to do for myself? How would I be healing for myself? And those are some of those value-oriented ponderings or questions you could ask. And you would want to be opening up to that. Chiron in Aries could even open this up here to where I have to cocoon with myself sometimes. And that would allow natal Chiron to be doing some healing as well in the 12th house. Chiron in the 2nd house has got to take some time to slow down and honor itself, honor your values from time to time, to have the energy to work with everything and everybody that is tugging away at you in some type of way or form or manner. So you're welcome to type in and let me know if perhaps some of what we may be uncovering here is wounding around valuing self. And to the degree that Chiron opens you to value yourself, you will create healthier boundaries. True for 7th house Pluto, natal Chiron. Okay. And you will create a healthier ebb and flow of when to be active and when to rest. One of the things about Taurus in the 2nd house that doesn't get spoken about as much, and Taurus in the 2nd house can sometimes be simplification. If you look at it just in the natural zodiac, there's so much energy that bursts forth from the 1st house that the 2nd then has to consolidate whatever's sustainable. And that consolidation is energy going back inward. And that energy going back inward is what can, what sustains us, as well as the resources that sustain us. In other words, the chaotic energy of new beginnings has to then be focused in order to continue a manifestation or sustainment. And so that is the archetypal energy that's behind that 2nd house of saying, wait a minute, slow down, simplify, prioritize what's important. And sometimes that's the healthier energy, and we'll describe the 2nd house as laziness. That yeah, you can get stuck into laziness and inertia. But when you look at that 2nd archetype as energy going inward, there's something about being able to say, what's important to me? What do I value? So how do I prioritize? And that then helps me know where to put my energy. And this could be relative to 4 planets in Gemini who just want to create all over the place. That then has to go, wait a minute, am I conscious of how I sometimes will overextend myself until I'm exhausted? So this Chiron transit in the 2nd house can be waking up Aries. When to act, when to rest. How to prioritize what I value, and how do I evolve valuing myself. Comments, questions, feedback as I look at our time. Anybody on the board as well, if they have something that I haven't addressed?
Well, our volunteer is just acquiescing to what we were said is very true. There's a lot more time for herself now and an opportunity now that there's retirement. But lots of restrictions in the past with feelings of obligations. And again, she wanted to give you credos and thank you very much for doing such a nice job.
Let's check in with anybody else on the board with, you know, we can look at this chart example. We can look at the previous one if there's something that, you know, a little question or whatever that something I didn't address. You know, I'll wait. Go ahead.
Clear.
And I just will clarify, you know, it's not that I'm trying to so overemphasize natal Chiron. However, you're getting my point that any forecasting planet is relative to its natal signature, because the forecasting planet is evolving the natal signature. All right. And so we just happen to have had 2 quite active Chiron signatures natally in these 2 examples. Stay tuned. We'll see if we continue on that way through this series. And I would encourage both of the 2 volunteers, you know, having as many Chiron aspects natally as you do, continue to reflect on Chiron's transit in Aries, because while this is where Chiron, for example, in volunteer 2's chart or through the 2nd house, while this is where Chiron is making things conscious, it's still going to relate back to this natal signature. And all 8 of these planets that Chiron is making an aspect to. All right. For instance, couple more tidbits for you, okay? Chiron, we didn't break this yod down. Chiron is approaching a waxing in conjunct to this natal Pluto signature. All right. So this is the internal crises, okay, in regards to what I'm responsible for and what I'm not responsible for. Healthy boundaries, 12th house, healthy boundaries, giving and receiving in the 7th house. Both Mercury and Mars, they're in the base sextile to Pluto, and they are the waning sextile to Pluto. They are the 300 degrees, that's still last quarter phase, okay? And so, you know, these Gemini planets that I didn't speak a lot about, do I or don't I? Do I or don't I? It can fall into the, you know, soul dynamic of, you know, doing, and
Catharsis.
feeling, well, feeling so, trying to do too much. Again, these are waning sextiles to Pluto. So it's going to start to bring in that last quarter pondering. What is mine to do, Gemini, and what is not mine to do, fifth house? What is mine to do for myself? And yes, there can be a lot of catharsis. There's as much mental energy going here as with our first house transit example, the sixth house Pluto mental energy. And so there's a surrendering here with that waning sextile. There's a surrendering of actions and what you can do and not do. You know, fifth house is another fire archetype, and they can sometimes feel, you know, that superhumanness. And so these two planets are also making waxing inconjuncts as well. And the waxing inconjunct is the 150 degrees. It is the Virgo side of the inconjunct versus the waning Scorpio side. It's the inner adjustments in the inner crises. So these two add to this picture of Chiron again. What's mine to do, what's not mine to do. What's mine to do for someone else and what's mine to do for myself. I'm really glad you're a retired volunteer. How did you do it all when you worked? Now, Jupiter, okay, is just past the 135-degree mark. Slower planet, Chiron, moving through the houses in zodiac to Jupiter. It is, you know, 15 minutes, 14 minutes past the 135 mark. It's just moved from first quarter to gibbous phase. But it's another one that has Jupiter pondering. How does it feel to do this and do that? Okay. All the self-sacrifice and giving that this Chiron signature does, Jupiter is at kind of a mini crisis point, square and a half, of thinking it can do more than it can do, especially with all these Gemini planets. And it's really, the crisis is about how does it feel? How does it feel at this moment to do this for that person, or to do this for this person, or to do this for this charity, or to do this for blah, blah, blah. And, you know, this is reiterating that crisis of what we can do for ourselves and what we can't do for ourselves. So while this Chiron in Aries transit through the second house can maybe feel like, oh, it's not doing anything, it is activating L8 of these natal aspects to Chiron, and perhaps, again, one more time, the slowing down. Don't just think that the second house is always inertia. Sometimes there's that need to slow down, pace, prioritize. And when it goes into Aries, some of this Piscean Florence Nightingale energy is going to dissipate, and it's going to be opening you up to more pacing of what to do, what not to do. This much time for that, and this much time for me. And you and everybody else has to be equal scales. Can you put as much into yourself as you do everybody and everything else combined together? That's your quest, volunteer. That's your healing, Chiron in Aries. All right. Thank you all. A few more slides. I searched for a female Chiron in Aries, and I didn't remember a female Chiron, not Chiron in Aries, but I just thought, again, I like this picture, but I thought, How about a female Chiron in Aries? If any of you come up with some that aren't all about sex and boobs, by all means send it to me and I'll share it. Because it's not just a masculine energy, you know. Chiron is opening up, you know, Chiron the healer is, you know, brings in the feminine energy just as much as well. So I thought I'd play with looking for perhaps some feminine archetypes of a centaur, even if they didn't exist in mythology. That doesn't mean we can't create them with Chiron and Aries and starting a new cycle of healing. And the ending of the Piscean age, bringing the female energy back into the healing process that used to probably be so very, very strong in all of us before the patriarchal distortions. Spirit of God, Goddess, come through me. Mind of God, Goddess, speak through me. Heart of God, Goddess, love through me. Body of God, Goddess, I am. There's your Chiron and Aries invocation. You can say it, say it, say it. You can put it into your unconscious self-healing exercises if you make any tapes for yourself. Okay, I will see all of you on Wednesday for those of you who tune in live, where we will look at the transit through houses 3 and 4. And then, of course, we will repeat this series with Uranus in Taurus in between. We'll have a Mercury retrograde webinar. So thank you all very much for tuning in. Appreciate those showing up live, appreciating those of you who listen in the future as we go through these Chiron transits. And I wish you all the best on your own self-healing journey. Thank you, everyone.